Hi there, my name is Lynn, and today we're going to talk about going from zero to live in about 45 minutes. You may recognize my voice from the MongoDB Podcast, where along with my co-host Nick Raboy, we spend time talking about software development, data, and all things MongoDB. Check it out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any podcast network. I work on the MongoDB for Startups program. And as part of that, I've had the pleasure of working with hundreds of startup founders and developers and helping them leverage the technology and resources they have at their disposal. I've learned a few things in common across all of these startup founders and developers. They all have a great idea. They're all extremely imaginative and bright thinkers. They all have passion for those ideas, and they're all extremely driven and hardworking. Unfortunately, that doesn't always lead to success. They also need access to resources and assistance. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, getting access to some additional resources and help along the way to build and launch your startup. The unfortunate fact is that 80% of all startups fail for one reason or another. One of the most popular reasons that startups fail is they don't have a market need for their product. Levon Krauss, serial entrepreneur and mentor at Techstars, Cornell, NYU, recommends to early stage startups that they focus on building a minimum viable product. That's focusing on building something and getting it out the door so you can get feedback and refine that idea and ensure that there's a market need for the product. Henrik Knieberg came up with this metaphor, this analogy of MVP. And I like what he says about developing a product, and perhaps we should, rather than calling it a minimum viable product, maybe we should call it the earliest testable product, or earliest usable, or even earliest lovable product. And that'll help us understand, really, is there a market need? Do we have an audience? Are we getting the right feedback? And are there even investors willing to invest in our product and idea? Today, we're going to talk about building a web presence for your startup and launching it. We're going to do it very quickly. And you're probably thinking, is this talk for me? What kind of skills do I need to have? Well, let's go through those really quickly. First, you're going to have an idea. I can't bring the ideas to the table today. You're going to have to know some basic HTML, some JavaScript, and know your way around some editor like Visual Studio Code. I'm going to give you all of the source code to get things started, but you will need to modify some settings, some parameters, and ultimately the content that will talk about your product or idea. You'll need access to a GitHub account, some basic Git skills like git clone, and you'll need a MongoDB Atlas account. And that's it. With that, you'll be able to get started. Now, you can start on your own with a very basic website, building it with HTML if you like. It could be a rather arduous process if you start from real scratch. And really, in the end, is it going to be what you want for your business? Unless you're really talented with HTML and CSS, probably not. And really, that's sort of like releasing a tire as your minimum viable product. Are you really going to have some happy users and get real valuable feedback to determine whether or not there's a market for your product with that approach? I like to focus on 4 F's when developing a product or building a website presence. It should be fast. There's no reason to spend days or weeks on your initial effort. It should be free. There are many platforms that give you access to hosting and deployment resources for absolutely $0. You should make sure that you have the ability to get feedback with the product that you launch. And that's through interactive forums and storing the information in a database. Whatever you launch, it should be flexible so that you can scale it as you grow. And that's what we're going to do today. What we build today, we'll call it a landing page. It's going to start with a simple call to action. And whether or not users are willing to click that initial call to action will give us some valuable feedback about our messaging and our landing page. Once they choose that call to action, they'll get to choose a pricing plan, and that'll give us additional feedback. And lastly, if they're really interested, they're going to give us their contact information, and we'll store that contact information in a database. Now, here's what we're going to create today. And Keep in mind, I didn't start from scratch with this. I started with a template. There are many templates out there, and the one that we're going to work with today comes from a website called startbootstrap.com. And there are many free templates and themes available there, as well as some professional paid offerings. But notice that this is going to give us a spot for our marketing statement to tell about our idea or service, and a simple call to action. Once the user clicks that call to action, it's going to give them some more information, more in-depth information about our product or service, and it's going to give them a range of options for pricing. We'll always want to have a free option. That's going to give an idea about what people are willing to pay, and then some additional options that may come with additional cost. Once users click one of those buttons, they'll have the ability to provide their contact information so that we can stay in touch with them. And we'll take this information on this form and we'll store it in a MongoDB database inside MongoDB Atlas. And lastly, we'll capture this information and we'll report it back using MongoDB charts. Now, you may not want to do this in your final deployed project to production. You may want to keep this on an admin page and private. So let's get busy and let's build something with the remaining time we have together. So if you haven't used MongoDB Atlas before, you'll need to register an account. You can do that by visiting cloud.mongodb.com. Click the button where it says sign up, provide your email address. Okay, once you've registered, you'll have a choice of cluster sizes to build from: shared, dedicated, and dedicated multi-region. For today's purpose, we're going to build a shared cluster. That's where the free instances live. So click Create a Cluster where it says Shared Clusters. Next, we'll get to choose from 3 different cloud providers: AWS, Azure, and GCP. Notice as I change the provider, the data centers change. So you want to choose a data center that's closest to where your activity is going to be. We're going to choose AWS, and since I'm in Philadelphia, that's rather close to North Virginia. I'll leave it at Virginia. Now I'll choose the cluster tier. And notice it says M0 Sandbox. That's our free forever instance. You never have to pay, and you never have to pull out a credit card. Next, we'll examine the additional settings, but because we're using the free instance, we're not going to use backup. And then we'll change the name of our cluster. We can call it 0 to live, or maybe my first cluster. Then click Create Cluster. This is going to take about 5 to 7 minutes for the cluster to actually create. And once it's done, we'll pick up and move to the next step. Okay, now that our cluster has completed building, we'll move this wizard out of the way and we can refresh the page and we can see our cluster. Now, the reason we launched that cluster is we're going to build a startup landing page that's going to collect data. So it's important that we have a scalable infrastructure to store that data that can grow with us over time. Now that we've launched the cluster, we can begin to configure the cluster so that we will be able to use it with our landing page. The first thing we want to do is add a database access. So we want to add users so that we have read and write access to the database. Under the left-hand menu, you'll find Security and then Database Access. Click that and then click Add New Database User. We'll use the authentication method of a password, and we'll set our password manually. Oh, this is our login actually. So we'll change the user ID to Mike and set a password. And here we're going to select read and write to any database, and then add user. Next, if we want to modify and view the data from our local installation, we'll want to add a whitelist for our IP address. That's going to allow us to connect to our database, our cluster, and use the resources from our IP address. So we'll click that in the wizard, and that's going to direct us to click on Network Access. From there, I'm going to add an IP address, and notice the handy button here that says Add Current IP Address. I'll click that, it'll auto-populate my IP address, and also notice we can make this a temporary change. We'll leave it permanent for now. I'll click Confirm. It will take several minutes for the change to deploy to the cluster. We can then add sample data if you want to see what some examples of good document structure look like, and you can then test connecting to your cluster. We're going to move on to the next step. Now that we've built a cluster, some of the changes are still deploying, so I want to move on and create a Stitch app. So with a Stitch app, we're going to be able to leverage our static landing page and connect to our database using the JavaScript SDK from MongoDB Stitch. Since we haven't created an app yet, I'll find the green button that says Create a New App, and we'll name this app 02 Live. And this is where we link the app to our freshly created database, My First Cluster. We'll leave advanced configuration alone for the moment, and I'll click Create Stitch Application. This is the Stitch landing page, and it's got some great information. As you begin to use your Stitch app, you're going to see things like the amount of data transferred, the number of compute gigabytes per second, and the total number of requests. This will be important as you begin to increase the users on your application. Note that we have a Stitch App ID. That's going to become important when we begin to build our static landing page content. Now with Stitch, with our Stitch app, we have the ability to store functions and run them remotely. We can create triggers which act as a result of something happening in the database. We can use GraphQL. We can even connect to our data and third-party services. But what I'd like to talk about for the moment is hosting. I'd like to enable hosting so that we can host our static HTML landing page. This is going to give us a place where on the internet potential users can find our content. So let's click on hosting and click the enable hosting button. Here you see that we've enabled hosting. It's going to take a moment for the DNS to propagate, but in the meantime, we've got this index.html file, and that's just the basic default index.html for your Stitch app. We're going to replace that over time with our startup landing page. Notice that we have a URL here. This is going to be the URL where we can get access to our static landing page. Right now, it's not going to work because it hasn't propagated the DNS, but eventually, once DNS propagates, we'll be able to visit this URL and see the contents of this index.html file. So we'll wait until the DNS propagates and we'll pick up there. Okay, as I mentioned, here's our DNS entry for our Stitch app, and here's our default index.html file. We can actually see the value of that if we visit that URL. Here we have 0 to live and our app ID. And this is the Hello World page. Now we obviously want to replace that with our landing page content. But before we do, we'll want to create a rule which will give access to the database to our Stitch app. So find the rules entry in the left-hand navigation, and then click the plus button next to the MongoDB Atlas service. We want to create a rule which enables the Stitch app to access our database for the application 0 to live. We can call this database anything we like. And the collection, let's call it responses, because this is going to be the collection that holds the responses to our startup landing page. Now we can choose a template that says users can only read and write their own data, but for the moment I'm just going to leave no template, and I'll click Add Collection. And because I want all users anonymously to read and write the data, we're going to identify the users anonymously. Obviously, you don't want users of a landing page to have to log in order to give their contact details. So we'll just leave it as read and write all data from all users. We'll click Save and then Review and Deploy. And this will take a few moments to deploy. And once we do, we've created a rule. Then we can create a user provider. Like I said, we're going to have anonymous users identified so that anyone can fill out the contact form on our landing page. So we'll click on Users and we'll find the Providers tab. With MongoDB Stitch, you have the ability to authenticate users with a number of providers: Apple, Google, Facebook, and even anonymously, like we said. So I'm going to edit the anonymous user provider and enable that. I'll save that and review and deploy those changes. Now we've prepared our Stitch app, we've prepared our cluster. Now we can start thinking about getting that content updated so that we're not just using the standard default HTML page for our Stitch app. Now I've prepared a theme and a template that you can use. It's on GitHub at my GitHub address, which is github.com/mrlynn/.live-0 to live. And there are a number of HTML and JavaScript pages here. The one that you're going to be interested in initially is going to be the index.html file. And we'll just take a quick peek. So this is going to display some information about your site. It's obviously fictitious at the moment, but once we put this in place, we'll be able to see that live. Find the clone or download on the main GitHub page for this repository, copy the address, and then open a terminal window and find an area where you want to store your site. So we'll clone that into this directory, and we can see all of our files that we've created. Notice we do have the index.html file there. And now we're going to want to get this content into our Stitch application hosting area. And the way that we do that is we first need to export our Stitch app from our Stitch environment. And instructions for doing that are in the deployment section under import export. You can find the instructions here. you export this app to your local development environment using the MongoDB Stitch CLI. So you can check out the documentation here, exporting an existing Stitch application, learn how to use the Stitch CLI. You will need to install that, and you can do that using npm. I've already got that installed, so I'm going to show you what that looks like. And I've actually created a number of handy scripts to help you along the way. So the first is stitch-cli-export. And again, this is going to export the site from within Stitch to our local environment so that we can begin modifying the local site and then importing it back into Stitch. Let's take a look at this script. Notice we're sourcing an environment variables, a set of environment variables, and then we're using the stitch CLI command to log in using those environment variables, stitch API key, stitch private API. Now, we haven't created this yet. We haven't created the .env file, and we haven't set the value of these stitch API and stitch private API keys yet. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll create the .env file, and I'm going to copy the stitch API key, and I'm going to set this equal. We're also going to need one called stitch app ID. And where do we get these? So these are API keys that we get from within Stitch. So we'll have to go back into our Stitch console, and first thing we can do is copy our Stitch app ID. It's up in the left-hand corner, and we can put that in place. And now we need to create API keys. And the place that you create the API keys is from the Access Manager. So we'll go into, we'll clear this message. We'll go into Access Manager and then Project Access. And here we're going to create API keys. We can give it a description, 0 to live, and we can copy our public API key, which is the first one. And we'll click the next button after we set permissions. And we'll click next. And now we can copy our private API key and add that to the file. Okay, so now we've created an environment file that holds our critical environment variables. There is one additional place that we need to modify, and we're going to put our application ID, our Stitch app ID, in a file called config.js. This is for the JavaScript component of our app. Notice I have one from a previous implementation here. I'm going to replace that with my current app ID, and that is going to be used by some of the HTML files that call in JavaScript functionality. Okay, now we've created a directory called Stitch, and within that directory we see the contents of our Stitch application. And the key thing here is our hosting and our files directory. Here's that default index.html file. That's the logo. So if we open that, we can see this is our hello world. And that's right from our laptop. So now we've exported the Stitch application hosting environment to our local laptop. We can now replace this code with the code from our landing page, which is up here in this directory. Now, what I've done is I've simplified this entire process by creating another script called stitch-cli import. Now, what this does is, again, it sources the env file and, again, leverages CLI login. You probably don't need to log in again, but that's just for safety. And here we're just commenting that we're going to copy our content into the Stitch hosting area, and that's exactly what we do. I know that all of the content for our landing page exists in a set of HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and some vendor script environments. So we copy those to our Stitch hosting files environment, and then we execute the Stitch CLI import command, passing our app ID and specifying that we want to include our hosting. And we specify that the path of /stitch should be used. So let's give this a shot and see if it works. Confirm the changes. And it looks like it's deploying the app and assets. Okay, so it looks like it worked. Let's verify this by going back to our Stitch console. Here's where we created our API key. We're going to go back to Stitch. We're going to go into our application. We're going to go into hosting. And here we see all of the files that we just uploaded and imported into our Stitch app hosting environment. Now, we've created a Stitch application hosting environment, and we're just using the default Stitch app ID hosting environment. We can replace this with a custom domain after we're done. But for now, let's check and see what this looks like. Here's where the default Hello World page was. If I refresh this, we should get our landing page. There we go. And there you have it. So we have our startup landing page right in Stitch in our Stitch DNS entry. Now, users will come to this page, they'll read our compelling marketing statement and more information about our startup product or service. They'll decide whether or not they want to click the button to learn more, which is our first call to action. There they'll get a list of options for free all the way up to enterprise offerings. Again, you're going to need to customize this for your specific offering. But once they click one of these buttons, they're going to be brought to a contact form where they can specify their details. And I'll put my work email address, and I'm going to let them know that I'm really just curious. Now, when I click Send Response, this is going to leverage the JavaScript SDK for Stitch to connect to the database and store our entry inside our Atlas database. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So let's click Send Response. And sure enough, it forwards us to a MongoDB charts page where we show the number of responses that have been logged. And I'm going to show you what that looks like after we're done taking a look at the data. So let's go back to our Atlas console. We'll go from Stitch back over to Atlas. And here we see our cluster. Here we see a button for our collections. And sure enough, we've got one document inside our collection. And this is the record that I just sent. So it's my name, it's my email, and it's my choice of payment options. I chose the professional level, and I let them know that I'm just curious. I'm also in the code capturing the browser. You can capture other logistical elements and store them as you need. Notice I have an owner, which is a random string which will uniquely identify each participant, each person that submitted a response. So now that we've stored data in our database, let's talk about how we might want to be able to report on that and create charts. So I'm going to go over to MongoDB Charts, which is right next to Stitch. I'm going to activate MongoDB Charts. And as the pop-up states, we're going to need to create a data source first. So we'll click on Data Sources. We'll click on Add Data Source. We'll click on the My First Cluster. That's where our data is. And we'll connect. Okay. Now we want to specify that we want to connect to the responses collection. And we want to set permissions. And let's just add everybody in the project. And we'll publish the data source. Now that we've got a data source, let's go create a chart in a dashboard. First, we'll create a new dashboard. We can call it 0 to live. And let's add a chart. We'll select our data source. And here are the fields that exist in our documents. So we have our ID, which we can use to count. But let's first choose a chart type. Keep it simple. Let's create a circular chart. And we will add the number of IDs created to the arc. And we'll also add interest level. Well, there's just one record at the moment, but that'll change over time. Now that we've created that, let's save it. And here's where we're going to want to embed this into our application. So I'll click the ellipsis and then I'll select Embed Chart. And the first thing I need to do is enable external sharing, because I want to share this data outside the charts environment. I'll turn that on. I'll enable unauthenticated because I don't want to have users log in and specify authentication first. I'll go back and I'll enable. And here's where I get the code to embed into my website. Now I could copy this entire code, but really if I'm going to be doing more than one, I might want to automate this process. So I'm going to grab just the chart URI here, and then I'm going to head back to my terminal. So I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to edit the thankyou.html page. Now you'll see that at the top we're setting the title to the page, and we're pulling in some JavaScript scripts. And here in the content of the page, we have a div. This is a section that is labeled with the ID of charts. Now we're going to manipulate that using jQuery. Note that we do pull in the jQuery libraries. Where do we pull those in? Here we go. We're pulling in jQuery because we're going to manipulate the DOM. We're going to change the section called charts to incorporate those charts URIs. So here I have two charts URIs that I got from my charts page. That looks just like the embedded charts that I copied from my charts page before. And then I'm using a jQuery function to loop through each of the elements in this charts URIs array, and I'm inserting those with an iframe. So if we look back at our thank you page, we can see that here we have two charts, and those are represented by these two URIs. So again, we go to charts and we copy the URI to the individual chart, and we place that into the thank you page in our charts array. We can add this one in there too. And we'll save that. What happened there? Oh, I think I copied too much. Let's go back here, copy that, and put that in the quotes. Now we have three elements, and if we save that, and we look at that locally, we should see three charts now. And sure enough, there we have it. These charts URIs are pointing to another cluster's data. That's why we have different numbers there. So there we have it. We've gone from 0 to an up and running landing page. The next step you will probably want to do is change some of this content to reflect your product or service. And then you're going to want to change the DNS entry. And you can do that when you go back to Stitch and you go into your app, go into hosting. Notice this is the current DNS entry. I'm going to want to go into the Settings tab and click the Custom Domain. Here we can put our domain name. I happen to have one called 0tolive.com. And it's going to be necessary for you to read some instructions depending on where you're hosting your domain. You're going to need to create a DNS entry that points to your appid.mongodbstitch.com. The full instructions are available on our docs site at docs.mongodb.com/stitch/hosting/use a custom domain name. So I'll bet you're thinking, where do you go from here? Well, think about modifying the content of our very simple landing page. You can check out startbootstrap.com. There are many free as well as paid options available for their themes and templates. In fact, here's the one that we started with. It's called Heroic Features. Next, you'll want to think about creating an email marketing campaign. There are some great options available. MailChimp offers a free tier that is actually pretty usable. So check out MailChimp.com. And then think about scaling your new landing page application. And to do that, you can check out the documentation site on MongoDB, docs.atlas.mongodb.com/cluster-autoscaling. A very compelling set of features around scaling your cluster automatically based on the utilization. Lastly, we've got a link to the GitHub repository that we started with. You'll want to visit our tech partners and other accelerators. Read up on our open source tools that we used as a part of this talk, HTML, JavaScript, and jQuery. And take a look at other features available in our data platform for MongoDB Realm, charts, and the database. In closing, we talked about focusing on a minimum viable product. Release early, get feedback, and pivot your product in line with those user feedback comments. Take advantage of the many resources available for startups. Remember to visit our product booths at mongodb.com/live/product. Thanks everyone for your time.